Hello, everyone. My name is Sophie. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in. We here at Books and Books, an independently owned bookstore in Miami, Florida, are so delighted to welcome you to a virtual evening with Dr. Clarence Lusane and Lissa Jones to discuss the new book, $20 and Change, published by our friends at City Lights Books. A bit about our guest: Dr. Clarence Lusane is an author, activist, scholar, and journalist. He is a professor and former chairman of Howard University's Department of Political Science. Lusane earned his BA in Communications from Wayne State University and both his master's and PhD from Howard University in Political Science. He's been a political consultant to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation and a former commissioner for the DC Commission on African American Affairs. He frequently appears on MSNBC and C-SPAN and was invited by the Obamas to speak at the White House. Author of many books, including The Black History of the White House, Lusane lives and works in the Washington, D.C. area. To moderate this evening's conversation, Lissa Jones is a highly sought-after speaker, facilitator, and coach for individuals and organizations serious about working to grow beyond the illusion of inclusion. Lissa was the content creator and host of Urban Agenda on KMOJ Radio, Minnesota's oldest Black radio station, for 15 years, keeping her grounded in the community she teaches about and the culture from which she emerged. Now in season 7, Lissa is also the host of Black Market Reads for the Gibbons Foundation for African American Literature, a podcast that seeks to amplify the voices of Black authors and writers about their craft and their works. Lissa is the chair-elect of the University of Minnesota Friends of the Libraries, and she has lived in Minnesota all of her life. Just a quick reminder that throughout the evening's broadcast, you can post any questions you have below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. We will be answering them at the end. Please order your copy of $20 and Change from Books and Books and support independent bookstores. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Sophie and Books and Books, and welcome, Dr. Lusane. I'm delighted to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the bookstore.
Indeed. I'm so excited to talk with you again tonight. Let's talk about your book, $20 and Change, Harriet Tubman, and the ongoing fight for racial justice and democracy. Let's begin with your inspiration. Why write about this? Why is it important to be talking about this, Dr. Lusane?
So thank you for the question. So what strikes me, what struck me in 2015 when it was announced by then Jack Lew, who was the Secretary of Treasury under Obama, there was an announcement that there will be changes to images on the $5, $10, and $20 bills. The changes to the bills were necessary due to security reasons, and the administration wanted to take advantage of making those changes to have more representative images on what had been all white male imagery on the currency that people carried around in their pockets. And the $5 bill would see Martin Luther King and Marian Anderson. The $10 bill would have women's suffragists and an image of a very famous march for women's vote, for the vote for women in 1913. And the one that got the most attention was the decision to put Harriet Tubman on the front of the $20 bill, replacing Andrew Jackson, who was then problematically supposed to be on the back of the bill. And so I felt that opened up a whole range of discussions about democracy, and that you had two individuals, Harriet Tubman and Andrew Jackson, who had very different visions for the country, and that should really be part of the discussion of why making this move made sense. And so that's really what kind of drove me to talk about the role and power of narrative, but also that narrative is not separate from transformation. And that's why the book is titled $20 and Change, that it isn't just about symbolism and representation, but also about substantive changes that have to happen that would benefit women, people of color, working people, LGBT community, and so forth.
This is excellent, Dr. Lusane. Thank you. Let's talk about narrative. If we were to compare and contrast the America that was seen by Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, Chief of the Indian Removal Act, and I don't say that lightly, I say that with a lot of emotions, and Harriet Tubman, who was accused of being a thief for stealing her own body back from enslavement. Can you talk to us about what were their narratives about America?
So this is really at the point a good way to kind of enter the discussion, because most people in the country, if you're over a certain age, you've heard of Harriet Tubman. She's not only U.S. famous, she's globally famous for her heroism, not only in her own escape, but going back and rescuing family members and other people in just the most dangerous ways you could possibly imagine. Not only from her being captured and killed, but just the territory she had to go through, where she could have been killed by nature, just kind of walking people from Maryland to Pennsylvania, right? But she did that, and people know that, and it absolutely deserves all of the honor, that it gets. But she lived to 1913. She had decades of life after that, and most of that people are unaware of. And so I wanted to highlight her role not only during the Civil War, where she was a spy, she was a scout, the first woman in U.S. history to lead a military operation. After that, she was involved in women's rights movement. She was involved in the suffrage movement. She spoke out for people who had disabilities and who were poor. And she did all the way to she passed away in 1913. Now you look at that compared to the person who's currently on the $20 bill, who not only enslaved people brutally, who made his fortune off of the slave trade, and then, as you point out, most or equally despicable is his attacks on Native Americans. Personally involved in massacres. He was a general. He led expeditions, destroyed villages, killed men, women, and children without mercy. And then, as you note, when he became president, pushed through the Indian Removal Act, which was the final, basically, nail in the coffin, removing people from their lands, ultimately led to the Trail of Tears. So what we have, two different visions of the country, two different notions of democracy, one that's inclusive, multiracial, multigendered, addressing issues affecting working people, and one that was essentially privileged white males. And so that struggle has continued on, and it manifests itself in 2023.
This is incredible to me, Dr. Lusane, because it's like a pictorial representation of where our country is on the $20 bill, an idea of an ideology of freedom, democracy with a small d for everybody, Harriet Tubman on the front, and freedom for only some, with Andrew Jackson on the back. Signs and symbols are a big thing that you talk about, a big theme in the book. Let's talk about the goddess Columbia and the money of the Confederacy. Lay it on us about the history of what the relationship is between those two.
Okay, so quickly, I would just say, too, there's still pushback against Andrew Jackson being on the back. So some of us are like, that just is not acceptable. You would not put Anne Frank on the front of Hitler World's Right. So I'll just let people know there's efforts to have discussions with the current Secretary of the Treasury and the U.S. Treasurer that, that's just not acceptable. So that will continue to be pushed.
Thank you, Dr. Lusane.
So the images really, as you point out, so there was an intentionality about the images that ended up on the bills, both on the Confederate side, because the Confederate issued bills during the Civil War, and on the Union side. And on the Confederacy side, so I mentioned that there were not women and there were not people of color on U.S. currency, But for the Confederacy, they actually did have black people as slaves. They had black people picking cotton and doing some other work on the currency that they issued. So anybody that thinks that the Civil War in the Confederacy was not about slavery simply just not paying attention. They were absolutely clear what they were about. And so they also had other images, one of which included the goddess Columbia. And this was Greek god of liberty, goddess of liberty, that had been used periodically from the beginning of the country to symbolize a destiny of why these Europeans who had come over should have the land that they had. And that image was used again and again and again and again. And the Confederacy appropriated it to put it on their currency for multiple layers of meaning. One around the sanctity of white women and how that was, part of the ideology that, was being constructed. But it also was this notion of we are being looked over, and there's images of Columbia kind of floating in the sky as white Europeans move westward and take land from the native peoples. And so, again, it was not accidental at all. And this is also then gets tied up with Christopher Columbus, and who never set foot in what is the United States at all. But I live in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, right? There's Columbia Circle, there's Columbus, Ohio, there's Columbias and Columbus everywhere in the country as, again, a mean for expressing a white version and a European version of what the country should be about, who it represents, and whose destiny is important, who's not.
It was so fascinating to me. I think to myself, what we perceive to be the seat of democracy with a small d is the District of Columbia, Columbia University, Columbia Pictures, that it's so ingrained in our daily thought that we don't even ask ourselves, Columbia what
Right.
or who?
Right.
So history shows up in the present. Teach us, Dr. Lusane, how this is showing up in American discourse today in 2023, this idea of signs and symbols, the idea of who owns the narrative.
Yeah, this is really important because the way in which people are taught, and through narrative and through education and other means of socialization, impacts how society functions and operates and how power gets distributed. So, for example, there's a chapter in the book called From 1619 to COVID-19. And what this chapter looks at is this issue of health for Black people in this country that basically has always been marginalized and simply not an area of concern. This Harriet Tubman I use as an example. Most people don't know she had a disability. When she was about 11 or 12, she was brutally hit in the head with some metal object. And as a result, she almost died, but she had seizures her entire life where she would just pass out, and she would just have this pain. She saw those in many ways as visions, but it was a disability. And this became one of the issues that she would actually take up later after the Civil War. But we saw this in the pandemic of 1919, the pandemic where 600,000 people in the U.S. died. Black people were segregated during that time, so Black people were not getting the kind of hospital care that could save folks. W.D. Du Bois wrote about Black people in healthcare. Right, this is something one of the areas, one of his writings that's probably least known. But it was the area he was concerned about because, of course, the health of people very much determines, how people can live and what people can do. So when COVID-19 emerges, initially from the Trump administration, the attitude is, well, that's happening to them people. It's happening to the Black people and to the Latino people and the people in the urban areas. It's not happening to my people, so I'm not doing a damn thing about it. And it wasn't until it started to happen to his damn people that it was some modicum of adjustment. But even beyond that, we have lots of data where Black people, when they were beginning to feel the COVID pandemic, were being turned away at hospitals or being sent home. Or there were attitudes that, well, Black people can kind of take the pain, so it's not going to be all that bad. This is just horrible ways in which embedded in the medical system are these notions of racial difference between whites and other people. So that has an impact on people's daily life. This isn't just a theory. It isn't just sort of a feeling. It means the way in which white medical personnel are trained becomes very critical, and Black doctors and physicians have pushed back because they have seen the consequences of this racialized medical system.
It's unbelievable that we are in a country where race is central to everything, and yet the whole idea is don't talk about it, ban the book, burn the ideas. It just is incredible to me, and it's a fight for narrative. Symbols reinforce narrative. So when I think about it, in this world in the evolution of COVID, where things are increasingly digital, where our interactions are increasingly recessed, is the conversation about the $20 bill still central to what we have to do to tackle the issues of the present and the past?
So you're right. There are days, if not weeks, when I go by, which I never touch currency at all. It just will sit in my wallet because I'm just doing everything, by credit card. So, we're in a very different place than, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years ago. But people still do interact with currency. And the larger point is, in spaces where narrative comes forth, how do we engage it? And do we kind of passively surrender to what are white nationalist framings, or do we fight for representation where possible? So those are spaces of contestation that we should fight. And we have been. I really want to emphasize that even though the Treasury Secretary made this announcement, for decades, women and people of color have been raising these issues. Didn't just start in 2015. We traced, when I was doing the book, tracing it back to at least the 1920s, where there were letters to the Treasury Department about where are the women, on the currency? Why have we got all these damn men, right? And we know there were Black people in the 60s who were criticizing the currency as, having all these white images. So it didn't just start there. And we know with like the monuments and the protests against the Confederate statues and all of that, that didn't start in 2020 either. I just found recently a wonderful image of Martin Luther King protesting at a Confederate statue down in Georgia, I think it was. Right. So, this goes back from the beginning. Black people never accepted these images, even when Black people were the labor that built these statues or built the foundations for these statues, right? There was still, resistance and protests and, never an acceptance. And I tell the story, there were Native Americans who never touched a $20 bill because they knew who Andrew Jackson was, even if, the rest of us sort of kind of knew or didn't know or were passive about it. So the resistance has always kind of been there. I think, for scholars, and this is what I teach my students, our job is to find this and to research and to bring this out and never assume that what we see now is just the beginning of everything, but that, there's always a history, there's always a past. Let's try to find that.
That is so critically important. When you talk about representation, just because people really, words matter and definitions matter, what does representation mean when you say it, Dr. Lusane?
So I think it means, it means inclusiveness, that everybody's story matters. And the way you show that it matters is in part through representation, but also through public policy. So one of the things I do in the book is to present opposition to the Harriet to the 20. So there's conservative opposition, which is we just don't want no black people, women, none of that. But there's also opposition from progressives and people I actually know who raise what I think are serious concerns, that this could be empty symbolism. It could be, I think, what some would call performative anti-racism, where the easy part is painting Black Lives Matter on the sidewalk, right? The hard part is addressing income inequality, access to housing, fairness and access to education. All the issues that matter in people's everyday life can't be disconnected from representation. And so that's how I see the two as, again, linked, that, $20 and change, the change part is absolutely critical.
I want to focus on that. It strikes me that a country that talks about liberty and freedom, but means it only for a certain few, just can't get the idea that liberation belongs to everybody, and that the world would be better if everybody is able to contribute in the most effective ways. Why and change?
So in many ways, the country's democracy is operating exactly as it was designed to do, which was not to be inclusive. So, often you will hear, this is not our country. This is exactly what the country was designed to be. We're trying to change it. Historically, people have been trying to change it. We're part of that long legacy and that long movement, right? Because it was designed purposely to give a few people privileged rights and everybody else just sort of there. And the whole history of this country has been the fight to expand and expand and expand rights to others. But it's also been the resistance and pushback from the other side ongoing. And that just has not abated. We thought, I talked about Harriet Tubman and voting rights. On her deathbed, she was encouraging Black women to be part of the march that took place in 2013, 1913. But she never had the right to vote. She died, in 1913. The 20th Amendment wasn't passed. The 19th Amendment wasn't passed until 1920. Voting rights wasn't passed until 1965. Right. So, these were long battles. And even now we're fighting over voting rights. And we're not even 6 weeks into the new year, and there've already been dozens of proposed voter suppression laws across the country. Dozens. So this is not going away, just as the far right insurrectionists are not going away. They're not, because they didn't totally succeed in January 6th. They didn't just say, yeah, we're going to go sleep. Right. They're still out there. They're still pushing back. And they've got support and encouragement and resources coming from highest places in this country.
In essence, we're talking about the fight for little d democracy. When you talk about $20 and change, Harriet Tubman, and the ongoing fight for racial justice and democracy, the two are linked. Dr. Lusane, as we prepare to wrap for question and answer, what's your call to action? What do we do? What do you tell your students to do?
So I in the book with a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer.
My favorite.
Another hero of mine. And she says, at one point, when she walked out her door, she was never sure she was going to come back alive because she had so many death threats and all of that. But she said, if I fall, I'm going to fall forward, and I am not backing off. And so that's the last words in the book. We don't back off, right? We just keep fighting, and this is what we do.
I love that you would end your marvelous work with the brilliance of Fannie Lou Hamer, who is too little known in our country and in the world, who most Black people don't know. You would never be able to vote for a Democrat or in the Democratic Party if it were not for Fannie Lou. And she said, I will fall 5 feet 4 inches, right? She's teensy in stature, but mighty in power. They stopped. Lyndon Johnson tried to interrupt her testimony at the Democratic National Convention. They were looking for King, but didn't see Fannie Lou. So I'm very proud of you, Dr. Lusane. And I just want to say thank you for $20 and change, for all the ways that you have not only inspired my thinking, but inspired me to be part of the active discourse to push back on narratives that are selective and not inclusive. Thank you to Books and Books. And thank you, Dr. Lusane, for a wonderful interview. Sophie, I'll turn this back to you to ask questions of Dr. Lusane. Thank you to our audience.
Thank you guys so much. That conversation was extremely enlightening. I really enjoyed it. We actually have a few questions from the audience. The first question is, did you have a specific research process for this book? If so, what was it?
So I hit the archives, which is kind of my go-to. Fortunately, being in Washington, we have the National Archives here, and then at Howard University, we have the Moreland-Spingarn, which is the archive of Black newspapers and other collections. And so, I can dig in there because there are a lot of things you're just not going to find, lots on the internet these days for sure. But there are archives that are not. So if you want to read, Black newspapers and, what were they writing about in 1918 when they had the pandemic during that period, go to those Black newspapers and you get a chance to see, or, in the 1800s, late 1800s, what were Black newspapers writing about when Reconstruction was ending, or when Plessy v. Ferguson's decision to legalize segregation, how are people responding? And so that's kind of one level. And then I, talk to everybody. I talk people get tired of me talking to them, but, I track down historians and scholars and, and everybody I can find to bounce ideas off of.
I always find the research process so interesting. I love hearing about it. We have another question, and I think this is our last question for the night. Is there anything you learned that didn't make it into the book?
Yeah, so there was a lot more I wanted to write about in terms of basically the threat to fascism in the U.S., which I see very much tied to issues of racial hierarchy. And so some of that we got in there, but, I had like a whole nother 2 chapters to try to put in, and my editors were like, the book is already long enough. And, so, there's more work to come. But, there's, that to me is really where we're at right now, is that we're at a precipice. We're really at a point where the country can go in kind of either direction, and understanding the link to race, which again, just a quick point, the January 6th report did not do. And it failed, I think, in that really critical linkage.
Right. Well, thank you both so much. On behalf of Books and Books, I'm so happy that you guys were able to have this conversation here. And thank you to the audience for watching. Please make sure to purchase your copy of $20 and change. And yeah, everyone have a good night, or wherever you are. I'm going to be ending the broadcast right now. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for a great discussion.
Thank you. Good night.